In this video, we are going to be talking about gains from trade. All right, don't worry, this isn't a video from chapter 2, this is from chapter 4. We're going to be looking at gains from trade in the context of our supply and demand. All right, so first, let's just draw up a quick little supply and demand graph. All right, so we got our demand and our supply. And then, of course, we're going to include our equilibrium price and our equilibrium quantity. Right, so we're going to talk about gains from trade kind of in two ways. We're going to talk about it from the perspective of a consumer. We're also going to look at it from the perspective of a producer. Right, we're going to start with consumers, but we're going to just kind of do a quick overview right here for both of them. All right, so looking at our supply and demand graphs, right, our curves, right, we know that our supply curve is all of the combinations of price and quantity supplied, right, for the current situation, right? So at various prices, how much are producers going to supply, right? We know the same is true for demand, all right, with some small tweaks, right? That is made up of pairs of prices, and then at that price, what is the quantity demanded? How much of the good are consumers wanting to buy, willing and able to buy at that price, right? And so any point along this curve, right, can give you that matchup of price and quantity, whether quantity supplied or quantity demanded. Right, but when we get to equilibrium, right, we find the intersection of our supply and demand curves, we find our equilibrium price and our equilibrium quantity. Right, so this equilibrium price, this is the price that's going to be charged, right, in the market. Right, and when you set a price, right, you set one price, right? Especially think about kind of major retail stores. I mentioned this in a previous filming or recording of this, so I haven't told you guys yet because y'all aren't going to see it because I messed it up. But you know, if you're thinking of kind of, you know, some small store where you can still haggle, this isn't necessarily what I'm talking about. This is kind of the places where, you know, Walmart, you go in, 88 cents for a can of green beans or however much green beans cost, right? You're not going to go up to the cashier and haggle over that. You're going to pay the 88 cents, right? It's kind of a simplified version, but that's kind of what we're looking at. All right, so suppliers in this market are going to be paid the equilibrium price for their good, right? And consumers in this market are going to pay the equilibrium price for this good. All right, but we can see, right, on the demand side, right, there are consumers who are willing and able to pay more for this good, right? How do we know that? Well, the demand curve, right, is above that equilibrium price, right? You can pick any point along this demand curve, right, in this region I'm kind of pointing at, right, the portion above the demand curve, right? And that's going to give you a price and a quantity, right? And that price is going to be higher than our equilibrium price, right? Similar thing for supply, right? Anyone in this section of the supply curve, right? This section that is to the left of our equilibrium quantity, and then we could also think below our equilibrium price, right? Anyone in this portion of the curve, right, was willing and able to produce and supply that good for a lower price than P star, right? But again, even if they were willing to sell it for lower, all right, as a producer, or willing to buy it for more as a consumer, they are still paying P star. All right, and this is where our gains from trade come in. All right, so for a consumer, their gains from trade, all right, it's what we call consumer surplus, all right, or the consumer surplus. All right, so consumer surplus, very basic level, consumers' gains from trade. All right, so that is what our consumer surplus is. It's just the gains from trade that is made by our consumers. All right, so on an individual basis, we've kind of already talked about this. Kind of the first thing, kind of the thing at the top I said about kind of when you go in, you find a good deal on something, right? You think you found a very good deal on a product, right? You feel like you would have been willing to pay more for it, right? That is you feeling that consumer surplus, right? Another example, just to give us a concrete example, is, actually I'm not even going to write this down, I'm just going to say it. So, all right, let's imagine we've got a individual consumer, right? Let's say it's Edith, right? Edith is willing to pay $50 for a rug, right? She goes to the rug store, if that's a thing, right? And she finds one that is $35 that she likes, right? So again, let's say that the equilibrium price for rugs is $35, just to make this example a little bit more simple, right? So the salesperson comes over and, you know, takes the $35, gives her the rug, right? Well, now Edith has the rug that she values at $50, right? That's how much the maximum she was willing to pay was $50 for this rug, right? So kind of we can say that that's her valuation of it, right? She thinks it's worth $50, right? Because she would have bought it if it was $50, all right? So she has that rug worth $50 to her. She also has $15 left out of the $50 she would have been willing to spend. Right, so her consumer surplus is that $15, right? The difference between how much she was willing to pay for the rug, $50, and how much she actually did pay for the rug, which was the $35. Right, so that is an example of consumer surplus on an individual basis. Now we are not. Usually we're not going to look at it on an individual basis. We are instead going to look at it on a kind of market basis. So let's go ahead and do that as well. All right, so price, quantity. So we're going to have our supply curve and our demand curve. And then we're going to mark our equilibrium. All right, so in this case, we're actually going to throw some numbers in here because we're going to start doing a little bit of math. All right, so down here, of course, this is the origin, so that is 0. Here, our equilibrium price is 26. And here, where our demand curve intersects the price axis, that is going to be 43. And then we'll just say that our equilibrium quantity is 50. All right, so one thing that you might be expected to do, or that you will be expected to do when looking at these, is if I gave you a chart like this, one of the very basic things that you should be able to do is, without me telling you that this is the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, to know that how to find those prices and quantities, right? Again, it's just finding where those curves intersect, right? And then kind of following those out. All right, but regardless, all right, so looking at this, all right, we know that any consumer that's willing to pay more than the equilibrium price, in this case 26, is going to get a consumer surplus, right? Well, everyone, right, in this part of the curve, right? So this part of the curve represents, right, those individuals who are willing and able to pay more than $26, right? So we can visualize our consumer surplus as the area on the graph above price and below demand, right? Because above price, that means for a consumer that you are willing to pay more for the good. Below demand means kind of, right, that's the cap, right? It doesn't just go on to infinity, right? So this, let's see how this would probably be the best way to do it. This triangle is the consumer surplus. All right, not only can we identify this graphically, all right, but we can actually calculate a figure for our consumer surplus. Right? So our consumer surplus, it's just that triangle, right? And so we can use the formula for the area of a triangle, 1/2 base times height, to find our consumer surplus. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. Oh, I should have probably just left that up there. I'm gonna have to draw it again anyway, so that's okay. All right, so again, our consumer surplus, which when we're calculating it, I'm gonna notate it as CS, so I don't have to write consumer surplus every single time. But we know it is 1/2 base times height, so we can go ahead and put that 1/2 in there. Our base, and this is a little hard without the actual graph there, right? The base is just kind of going from the origin point, right, to our quantity demanded. So in this case, or our equilibrium quantity. All right, so in this case, it's 500. Right, and then the height of our triangle is the difference between where our demand curve intersects the price axis and our equilibrium price. All right, so 43 minus 26. All right, so 500, again, this is just our equilibrium quantity, right? So going along the bottom of our graph, 0 to wherever, right, we have that equilibrium. That's our base. All right, then our height, right? The triangle kind of went from 26 to 43 on our vertical axis. All right, so once we punch that into our calculator, we should get a consumer surplus of 4,250. Right, but that is how we would calculate a consumer surplus. Right, now let's move on to our producer's surplus. All right, conceptually very similar. You probably write this definition down yourselves without me even having to do it. It is, or the producer surplus are producers' gain from trade. All right, so again, a lot of the same concepts that we talked about with our consumers, right, are true for our producers as well. All right, so based on differences in kind of the skill level of the person producing a good, access to technology and capital, right? Multiple different reasons, right? Some producers are going to be able to produce something, all right, produce a good at a lower price than others. Right, so when they are able to produce the good for a lower cost than, you know, what they're going to be charging, right, the equilibrium price, then they're going to have those gains from trade. Right, so very quickly, very similar to that Edith example, right, if I'm selling, I don't know, let me say I'm selling gumballs out of a gumball machine, right, just because those have a pretty standard price, right, so it was what, 25 cents a quarter for a gumball, right, if I am able to produce gumballs so if all the costs involved with me getting those gumballs into that machine, right, if that's 20 cents each, right, then my producer surplus is 5 cents, right, because I would be willing to sell it for as low as 20 cents, my costs, right, where I can break even, right, but if the industry standard is 25, I'm not, and also they don't make a 20 cent coin, right, then I'm going to charge 25 cents per gumball. All right, once again, we can look at our graph that I'm going to have to, it's the exact same as the one you've already got on your paper that we did the consumer surplus with, but I erased it, so I have to redraw it now. All right, so once again, we've got our demand curve, we've got our supply curve, we've got our equilibrium, and then we can notate that. So 43, 26, 0, and 500. All right, so now that we've got this back up, all right, once again, all right, we actually, you know, we don't have to go through all of this, right? So very similar to our graphical representation of the consumer surplus, right? The producer surplus, right? It's when a producer is willing and able to sell the good for a lower price, but gets that equilibrium price, right? It's that difference, right? This part of the curve represents all those suppliers who are able to produce this good at a cost lower than the equilibrium price. So this triangle, right, below price and above the supply curve, this is the producer surplus. All right, once again, it's a triangle. We can calculate our actual producer surplus using a similar formula. I'm going to try to just sneak it in right here. So once again, 1/2 base times height, still using that area of a triangle to get our answer. Right, we look for our base. Right, in this case, the base is the same for the producer and consumer surplus. Right, because the triangle stretches from 0 to 500, so we've got 500 here, and then our height, right, 0 to 26, so actually we didn't even need to do any subtraction, we can just write 26, all right, for this one. All right, so once we throw all of that into our calculator, right, 1/2 times 500 times 26, we're going to get a grand total of 6,500. Right, when we have our producer and consumer surpluses, right, we can put those together for our total surplus. Right, this total surplus is just the total gains from trade, right? So the gains of consumers and the gains of producers all put together, right? When you just add these two together, the consumer plus the producer equals the total. One thing I think that is the last thing we're going to do in this video. One last thing before we, hope that didn't sound too bad. Just hit the mic. Anyways, so one thing I want to mention with these is these don't really have units, all right? Our consumer surplus and producer surplus, we really don't associate any units with them. We just kind of would put them up here as 4,250, so on and so forth. Right, what we're going to use these more for is when we start introducing other elements into our kind of model, right? Our supply and demand model that we're going to be getting into in the next couple of chapters. And we're going to see how that affects, right, consumer surplus, how it affects producer surplus, how it affects total surplus. All right, how do these different things affect the gains people are going to be able to make from trade? All right, so consumer surplus, producer surplus, these are going to be kind of carrying through for the next couple of chapters, so they are important things to keep in mind. But that is it for this video. In the next one, we will start looking at shifting our supply and demand curves when they are together. All right, I will see you in the next video.